All right, welcome back, friends and comrades, to a very special episode with scholar Josef Gregory Mahoney, who is joining me from Shanghai. He's a professor of international relations and he's a doctoral supervisor at East China Normal University. Professor Mahoney is also the founder and director of the Center for Ecological Civilization. He is a frequent writer on issues in modern Chinese society and politics. He consults regularly on matters of governance and international affairs with China's central government. Um, and part of what I've been interested in on our show, we've talked quite a lot about understanding China, understanding China's place in contemporary politics, geopolitics, in the international arena. But I've really wanted to focus on, and this is something that Professor Mahoney writes about quite a lot, which is the sort of main currents, the sort of what are the main currents of contemporary Chinese Marxism. We've done some work on the Cultural Revolution, on Maoism, but most of our work on Maoism has frankly been on Western Maoism. So today's conversation is an opportunity for us to get a kind of 30,000-foot overview of some of the main currents of contemporary Chinese Marxism. I think, for example, just to sort of set the stage, a lot of people probably don't realize, but Xi Jinping himself writes quite a lot about Marx and Engels. And much of that is not translated into English, as far as I know, Professor Mahoney. And you've written quite a lot about Xi's own reading of Marx. He gave a famous speech, I think in 2000, was it 6, I believe, perhaps, on the biography of Marx, which was then subsequently studied heavily and is still studied to this day. So welcome to Emancipation's podcast. It's very nice to have you. Could we begin with a bit of an understanding about how you see contemporary Chinese Marxism and how we struggle to develop, as we were talking a moment ago, a sort of clear account, academic account of the main current? Why is it such a challenge to derive an academic analysis of the main currents of contemporary Chinese Marxism?
Well, thank you for hosting me, Daniel. It's a pleasure to join you, and I look forward to sharing some insights. I think one of the things that when we talk about main currents, we have to. It's probably useful to specify that when we talk about Chinese Marxism, there are variants. There are Chinese Marxism is not a monolith. And there are a lot of Marxists in China who are not even Chinese Marxists. They maybe move more in the direction of classical or Marxism, and some that are still strongly influenced by old Soviet models. But of course, the dominant form in China, certainly what's propagated and taught in the schools and certainly driving policy, is the Chinese Marxism associated with the CPC, and specifically how it's articulated by the current leadership. You're correct. President Xi has invested a lot of time and effort in developing Marxism in China, and so this is something that is an interesting question to ask. In so much as there was in the post Mao years up until President Xi, there was this narrative in the West, and certainly even among Western Marxists, people like David Harvey, of course, who I think infamously put Deng Xiaoping on the cover of his was it The Brief History of Neoliberalism or something like that. He sort of a rogues gallery of David Harvey, of Margaret Thatcher, Pinochet, Reagan, and Deng Xiaoping. So there's been this narrative for a long time that in the aftermath of Mao Zedong, that the Communist Party was no longer communist, that they were no longer Marxist. And the extent to which these narratives survived were really historical legacies or embarrassments of association. I think what we have seen in the new era, as we call it since President Xi came to power, is that Marxism is very much alive and well. And indeed, Marxism has always been driving a lot of the strategic thinking and development of China from the Mao period until the present. And we can see clear lines of continuity to illustrate this. And of course, this has been disconcerting to a lot of Chinese liberals, but it's also been something that people in the West who consider themselves hostile to Marxism and socialism, that they've decided to target in various ways, trying to go back to sort of an old Cold War rhetoric. But that said, with that sort of preamble out of the way, one of the things that we've seen, I'll give you an example of a couple of points that we've seen from President Xi that sort of demonstrate currents that link to the project as a whole, going back to Mao Zedong. So one of the key ideas that he's advanced is the idea of the two integrations. And sometimes this was when this term was first introduced, it was being translated into English as the two combinations. And by the way, most of what she says that is important about Marxism or policy has been translated into English. It is available. Your audience can access most of his key writings in Qiushi, Qiushi, which is the journal of the Central Committee. They publish most of his key speeches, and then they've been collected and published in translation so far in 5 volumes of selected works, but there are also some additional volumes. So there have been 5 volumes of the governance series, but then a few other volumes. So there's been no shortage, I think, of dissemination, translation and dissemination. That said, the two integrations is something where Xi Jinping says that what is unique about Chinese Marxism is that from the beginning, it took Marxism and integrated it with some core values and traditional ways of thinking that were native to China historically, and that this is the first integration. So not just situating Marxism to the unique conditions and situations facing China in the early 20th century, but also linking it very fundamentally to some epistemological values, ways of thinking that were always a feature of Chinese thought. And then the second integration is that China continues to learn from others, but it also continues to learn from itself. So it continues to go back and sort of parse 5,000 years of cultural history for insights into the human condition and surviving over the long term. And so one of the key ideas here that President Xi has emphasized is he's gone back to the first principle of Taoism, which we associate with Lao Tzu. And the first principle there is harmony between people and nature. And so this has become a core value now in Chinese Marxism today. And it's, of course, driving not only the tremendous efforts of environmental protection and ecological recovery in China, but also the green transformations, the green development, and how these are extending globally through BRI and other projects. So that's the first point. But I can take that now to a deeper level, if you would like, and explain what specifically is at the heart of that first integration that really distinguishes Chinese Marxism from the Soviet variety, or the classical Marxism, or even the Western Marxisms that emerge as a reaction to the Soviet model. If you want me to take that.
I would like that. I do want to say a couple of things before I invite you to do that, and that is that I have a lot of skepticism about the wider project of Chinese Marxism in its current iteration, But I have skepticism that goes both ways. I'm equally skeptical of David Harvey putting Deng Xiaoping on the front of that book and these kind of crude or reductive dismissals of the socialism with Chinese characteristics, as we often call it. But at the same time, I have serious questions about the status of class struggle in China, which I want to talk to you about. I have serious questions about the role of censorship at the state level. I know that Xi focuses a lot of his theory on the restoration of democratic centralism, which is very important to him, which of course has a long tradition in Leninism, right? And I feel as if it just at the outset of our conversation for my listeners, it probably is a bit uncanny because for us, doing Marxism in the West is a bit of a renegade project, very much so, right? We're obviously persecuted. We're obviously marginal, right? And that's a choice that we make, right? Whereas in China, Marxism is not marginal. To conceptualize that is a very difficult task, I think, for a lot of us in Western Marxists. So with that little proviso, I do want to get into some difficult questions. But please, yes, please give us a sense. And even as we were speaking before, Professor Mahoney, regarding the distinction that you made between thought and practice and then theory, right? What is the meaning of the adoption of a form of thought versus how theory functions in the class struggle? Those things I would also invite you to articulate as you describe kind of the uniqueness of Chinese Marxism. So I would invite you to please do so.
Well, I think there are two problems that Westerners generally and let's say three problems that Westerners generally, but Western socialists or Marxists have in understanding China. The first is I think Western Marxists mislead themselves in what they perceive to be an understanding of the dialectic. First of all, the dialectic as the Chinese understand it is different. And there's something problematic in even the Marxist dialectic. And whether we want to lay this at Marx's doorstep or at Engels and the dialectics of nature or the Soviets, it doesn't matter. There's something problematic in even the Marxist dialectic that I believe that the Chinese are able to correct. You and I were having an earlier conversation, and I said something in my usual way, which is of all the books written by Lukács, the only one today that deserves close study is The Destruction of Reason. Now, I'm very, very sympathetic to Lukács's project, not simply because I'm a polemicist serving the CPC, which I think anyone who would be a critic of China or a critic of me would certainly put that label on me. And certainly that was a label that was put on Lukács in that work. I'm sympathetic to Lukács because I agree fundamentally with his attempt to really bring as much as he can against Heidegger and that Nietzschean tradition, which I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which that is something that continues to play a major role in the West, thanks to thanks to people like Hannah Arendt, who is certainly the patron saint of a lot of Western liberals, who used her position as a Jewish intellectual to sanitize the absolute evil ways of thinking and behaving that we see in Heidegger's work and record. And certainly, the influence of Nietzsche via later people like Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and others these have been used to subdivide the left and to further confuse people. But let's not go too far down that path. Let's just alienate certain people as we can.
Right. Well, it does. It does. Just while we're making this slight digression, we'll come back immediately. But it does. It is interesting that there's a recent book that looks at every book of philosophy that Mao read as a young man, and he was drawn to the irrationalist tradition, right? Schopenhauer and Nietzsche piqued his interest. That's not to say that he necessarily incorporates them into his thought, perhaps a bit, right? But there was actually a very, very
in his early days,
right.
he was an anarchist. He started off, as he was, like a lot of people who come to Marxism after their formative years, they do so generally with some sort of complete revolt against wherever they came from, and that is often leads to some sort of phase of sort of an immature anarchist moment. And then once you get into that empty space, you then start like, oh well, this is not going to work out. I'm going to need to actually be organized and create some sort of useful way forward. And then some people are intelligent and find their way to Marx and move forward in that manner. But the point that I wanted to make about the destruction of reason is that I think I'm broadly sympathetic to Lukasz's project, but I think he's also limited because, like a lot of Western Marxists, or in his case, whatever sort of Marxist he was, because we put him in that camp, but then we also put him in the Soviet camp, that they're too Western. There's something fundamentally wrong. And the problem manifests in its grossest forms in people like Heidegger and Hitler, but it's not just that. There's something else that's wrong. And to a certain extent, Hegel and Marx are pointing to this problem and trying to give us a corrective, but even they come up short. And come up short for two reasons. One, because Hegelianism and Marxism don't really take root in the West. There's something that blocks that. And it's not just the resistance of capital and the fact that there is a deeper cultural linguistic problem. And we can take this all the way back to the Greeks and Sanskrit if we wanted to, in so much as just to get this out, if we go to Kant, who is supposedly the one who awakens Hegel, Kant, who writes the Critique of Pure Reason and says, okay, there are two ways of thinking, linear or the analytic versus the dialectic. And in his logic, in his lectures on logic, he says, okay, the dialectic is the logic of illusion, it's metaphysical juggling, and the analytic, which is really the product of Aristotelian thought, which is really itself an expression of the three laws of logic, the central law being the law of non-contradiction. This is what's really driving central to the Enlightenment, but also the real valid way of thinking. And we could go back to Aquinas and say Aquinas bringing back a strong form of Aristotle during in 1265 with the Summa Theologica, which sets the stage for the Renaissance and all the things that will follow thereafter. That's all well and good, but one of the questions is where does Aristotle find the law of non-contradiction? He doesn't find it under a rock. He finds it through his thinking. It's and what's sort of interesting is that we see a law of non-contradiction expressed in the Hindu Vedas going back long before Aristotle, and we find no direct transmission from the Hindu tradition to the Greek tradition. But we do know that Greek is one of the languages that belongs to the Indo-European family of languages, which is to say that we believe that the law of non-contradiction is prefigured logically in the grammar and structure of Greek, and likewise in ancient Sanskrit. And it also is unfortunately very powerful in all the other European languages, save for relatively minor ones, including English. So there is some sort of concern that there is this fundamental orientation towards a law of non-contradiction, which would not only resist a dialectical way of thinking, but would promote this way of thinking that is based on radical differentiation of an either-or perspective, a zero-sum perspective in terms of policy making. And that's interesting in so much as if we had to understand what's the fundamental difference between China and the West, including India and others, is that in China, it is precisely the opposite. We have the unity of opposites. The unity of opposites as sort of the first principle, not the law of non-contradiction. In fact, we even sometimes call it the law of contradiction in China as an opposite expression of the Aristotelian tradition, which is the key feature of yin-yang thought, which, as Lao Tzu holds, is the true ancient thought in China. We can go back to the early formation of Chinese characters and Chinese writing, even before we have the text written by Lao Tzu, even before we have things like the I Ching, or what we call in English the I Ching. We can see that logic already at work in the way characters are being conceptualized and expressed during the Shang dynasty several thousand years ago. So this is the key feature, and we see that every major school of thought that has taken root in China, from Lao Tzu to Confucius to Buddhism, which had to be Sinicized by combining the Lotus Sutra with Lao Tzu, and then later the arrival of Marxism. They're always finding a way to Sinicize these in ways that correspond with yin-yang thought. But the key in yin-yang thought, what differentiates it from Western thought, and indeed what the key word is the word and. It's interesting because we may recall that when Kierkegaard left Copenhagen for the first time, he went down into Germany and he took classes with Hegel, and he hated the Hegelian dialectic. He comes back to Copenhagen. He writes his first book in Danish, and the title is Either Or, right? And he says the problem with Hegel is that Hegel is the philosophy of and the only way that we can solve problems in the modern world is through the philosophy of or. Now, of course, we know that Lukács is targeting Kierkegaard as well. Kierkegaard, the scion of Lutheran ministers, already part of that Protestant Reformation that is the new religious ideology of the capitalist mode of production. So it's not surprising that we would have in that context the birth of existentialism and this new philosophy of the individual. But the key here is that when Mao, not just Mao, but before Mao, you have figures like Li Dajiao. And Li Dajiao was the head of the library at Peking University and the head of a reading group, the Marxist reading group there, in the wake of the May 4th movement. There were a lot of what they call the 100 schools of thought in the wake of the May 4th movement, where people are trying to find new solutions to what they call the crisis of Chinese modernity. And one of the reasons why Marxism is being accorded such direct attention is because of the success of Lenin's revolution that has now put Marxism on the table as a viable alternative. And you have Li Dajiao, who is a peasant, and working as a librarian assistant is Mao Zedong, who is a peasant. And these two men are reading Marxism and they're encountering the dialectic, and they're interpreting the dialectic in a Chinese way, right? And we see that later maturing in Mao Zedong's writing for a number of reasons that we can express politically. But we see that maturing in terms of his writing in 1937 with what we call the two classics, On Contradiction and On Practice. And what's interesting is that a large number of people, even people in China, they don't realize what's really unique about On Contradiction. And they don't realize it because I'm not sure that Mao himself initially realized it, right? And there's even a reason why you might be misled in the first paragraph. And that's because in the first paragraph of On Contradiction, Mao Zedong is citing Lenin, and he's referencing Lenin's use of the term the unity of opposites, right? And this is very important to Mao and to the Chinese, because this is the direct epistemological linkage to this Chinese way of thinking. But if we go and we dig deeper into those references from Lenin, we'll see that Lenin's concept of the unity of opposites is always an either-or formation. There's always a fundamental struggle. If you want to frame this as a class struggle, where there's always going to be an antagonism, and it's always going to be sort of a zero-sum game, right? That is really more consistent with a linear way of thinking, with the analytical way of thinking. In Mao's case, the struggle is always an and, okay? It's always an and. So when Mao is writing On Contradiction in 1937, he's writing this the year after they had captured who we call Jiang Jieshi in China, but the international community calls him Chiang Kai-shek, captured him in Xi'an. And, you know, because of Chiang violating the First United Front, killing so many communists in 1927 and 1928, many people in the party wanted to kill him. And instead, Mao forced the Second United Front, okay? This is an and. This is not an or. This is an and, okay? There were other issues, okay, where we see the formation of an and. For example, the idea of the peasant worker alliance. In classical Marxist theory and even in Soviet theory, peasants have no role in the revolution. They're to be distrusted, okay? But from the beginning, Li Dajiao and Mao Zedong were peasants. And they also realized that the only way you could truly mobilize China and turn it into a modern nation state is to mobilize 90% of the population. Otherwise, there was no hope, okay? So that's an and. It's not an or, it's an and, okay? We can see this constructively throughout all the other aspects. Now, that and in the center of On Contradiction is something that Mao will later reinforce. It's interesting because 1937, he publishes On Contradiction and On Practice. 1938, Stalin reacts with his little book on dialectical and historical materialism, which is intended to repudiate Mao. And when he does that, he basically restates the key points raised by Engels and Lenin. And there, these will center primarily on the three laws of the dialectic. Later, Mao Zedong will dismiss this explicitly and say, no, only the unity of opposites. This is the only law. All the others are false, okay? And as he's doing that, he will go back to Laozi. He will go back to Zhuangzi to reinforce these points, okay? Now, there are some people in the West who have drawn a connection between Zhuangzi and Nietzsche and tried to say that the Taoist movement in China was always anarchistic or something like this. I think this is wishful thinking. What has been neglected, however, even in China, is the influence of Laozi and Zhuangzi on Mao's thinking and how he helped redirect the dialectic. So that's the point, the epistemological point. But to get to your question on class struggle.
Well, actually, I wanted to, if I could I have a follow-up on this?
Yeah.
Could you articulate how the singular path of Chinese Marxist thought developed? Because in prior conversations, you had identified three currents in the movement. One coming from a Soviet-trained intelligentsia that came back to China. Two, Mao and a more peasant-oriented track. And then three, a kind of Western, largely French-trained track. And you argue that contemporary Chinese Marxism must be understood as the kind of victory or the triumph of the Mao camp. Could you perhaps say a few things about that?
So initially you had, let's just say as a simple typology, there were three major currents in the party in the 1920s. Right? One current would be people like Mao, like Li Dajiao, there are a few others notable names, who are thoroughly Chinese. And then and of course, when the party held its initial meeting in Shanghai in 1921, there were two representatives from the Internationale here, because I'm in Shanghai, that were guiding those discussions. Mao was also present as a delegate representing Hunan. There were also people like Deng Xiaoping, like Zhou Enlai, who were sent to France and worked in the factories and became radicalized through that experience. Some of them then went onward to the Soviet Union to advance their training and their studies of Marxism. Some of them came back to China directly. Mao did not go abroad. Mao is, what really makes Mao unique among the senior leaders is that he was a peasant and from the countryside, and he didn't go abroad. So he's the native son among others, right? In the case of, and then you had this other group that we frequently refer to as the Chinese Bolsheviks, who didn't go to Paris or didn't go to France, but went directly to the Soviet Union. And it's this group that had the strongest relationship with the party in the Soviet Union. And it was this group that then wielded ultimately control of the CPC up until the early 1930s. And it's in part what contributed to the disastrous CPC response to the attacks on them by the Kuomintang in 1927 and 28, and then how the CPC responded to the encirclement and eradication campaign launched by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang thereafter. So what happens is you have let's just call them the French group in alliance with the Bolsheviks, the Chinese Bolsheviks. And that's what's dominating the party. And then you have a group that is largely around Mao. Mao had, gone to Hunan to investigate the peasant uprising, and the nationalists were declaring it a peasant terror. The CPC, which was in a unity government at that time with the nationalists, was calling it a unity terror, a peasant terror. Mao went down and investigated it, and and was in part marginalized in the party because he was a peasant, because he didn't go overseas, because he didn't go to the Soviet Union. And he went down and investigated and said, no, there are actually a lot of progressive elements at work in the peasant revolution in Hunan, and these would be instrumental in potentially in a revolution, in a socialist revolution in China. So what Mao ends up doing, he ends up getting further marginalized in the party because of that. And so he basically is left to his own devices to start going to the rural areas to develop base areas. Those base areas will survive 27 and 28 when the Kuomintang is attacking. And in fact, the communist leadership, which is again dominated by Moscow, will escape these base areas and then supplant Mao as the leader in those areas. This will then see, the movement of the eradication and encirclement and eradication campaign. It will lead to the Jiangxi Soviet, which the Moscow directed CPC members decided to try to hold, while Mao was advocating a guerrilla strategy. In other words, you don't, face a superior force head on. You need to abandon this and go into a mobile operation. The leadership overruled him. They got encircled. They then had to create a suicide brigade of 10 to 12,000 that ran towards the Guomindang line. The Guomindang didn't know how many people were coming. This caused the line to come like this down to absorb that suicide brigade, which created a weak point here. And then the main force of the communists, about 100,000, broke out through that weak point. And that's what initiates the Long March. Then in the middle of the Long March, they stopped in Junyi, had what we call the Junyi Conference. And the Moscow associated leaders refused to self-criticize, refused to take responsibility for the strategic mistakes. And that's when Zhou Enlai, who was the leader of this French group, broke with the Moscow side and joined with the Mao side, and then Mao becomes the leader. And that's when we see the greatest strategic retreat in human history, as described by U.S. military historians in the Pentagon itself, which will then culminate in the base area in Yan'an, where Mao will then write these core documents that become the founding text of Chinese Marxism. So, and when he's writing that, part of what he's trying to do is distinguish his line from the Soviet line, because he's only recently vanquished the Soviet stranglehold on the CPC at that time.
So the Sino-Soviet split has a sort of seed that is planted at this moment. Could we say, is that accurate? And could you illuminate the significance of the Sino-Soviet split as well? How much of it
Sure.
did?
I think there are a number of key dates. I mean, certainly that was part of it. I think later, Mao is a faithful communist. He goes to the Soviet Union. He doesn't like Stalin personally. He doesn't like later, during the Korean War, the fact that the Soviets won't commit air power to support the Chinese troops, which will lead to about 1 million Chinese, we estimate, falling, including his own son. So these are all concerns, but where things really start to mature in dramatically negative ways is in 1956. And we generally blame the secret speech, Khrushchev's secret speech, and de-Stalinization as something that had provoked China. And again, China didn't like Stalin, and they believed, but at the same time, they also understood that Stalin is what happens in a country that is fighting for its life against Hitler. And not to make excuses, but they had also learned lessons. So, for example, they had said, the Soviets had gotten stuck in a trap of killing, and killing begets killing, and so we need to limit the extent to which we kill people in our own revolution. Otherwise, you'll start this unstoppable circle. And so they had learned those lessons to a certain extent, and they had also improved on the model, but both the way that they built the party institutionally, but certainly also in the implementation of the mass line, which is something that Xi Jinping goes back to very vocally when he first comes into power. So yes, democratic centralism, yes, a Leninist party, but yes, it's also vitally necessary from the masses to the masses. You have to have that direct link to the masses. And indeed, the largest number of people, party members in China today, are still farmers, or still people in the countryside. But that aside, 56 is an important year because the de-Stalinization effort was something that created problems for China, because up until that point in time, they had been forced to co-brand their revolution with the image of Stalin, right? And so they're part of their political legitimacy, part of all the things they've been doing as this positive association with Stalin. And by the way, they're still,
and also their finances too. They were also financed.
They're still trying to consolidate the revolution. They're still fighting white Chinese elements. They're still trying to consolidate in various parts. They've still got an ongoing civil war with the Kuomintang in Taiwan. They just fought the war in Korea. You know, it was Chinese artillery, 70,000 Chinese artillery dressed in Vietnamese uniforms that knocked the French out of Dien Bien Phu. They're on the front lines. Okay, that's 54. So and now they're fully engaged in Vietnam. And then in 56, Russia does this thing where Russia basically says, well, you know, Stalin was evil and all the things that Stalin did was evil. And China was having to legitimize its own position with Stalin's image and Stalin's friendship. And now they feel like they're being undercut precisely when they're still fighting to consolidate and fighting these external foes. So that's one issue. The second issue is in 1956, many people, including Mao, became suspicious that the Soviet aid and advice related to the first five-year plan was a conspiracy of sorts to make China dependent on the Soviet Union for technology and finance, to turn China into a factory of the Soviet Union. And the key thing you have to understand about the CPC or any other political system that was seeking to take power in China is that sovereignty is the key issue, right? That's what really was driving, and still to this day, why sovereignty is the number one issue. It's the thing that guides Taiwan concerns, Xinjiang, Tibet. All of these link fundamentally to the issue of sovereignty. So being a responsible steward of the national interest is your first priority, the first source of your historical legitimacy. So there's this concern in 56 that this is a problem. And then there's a third issue, which we see in Mao's writings. We can see this in his selected works, where he says in 56 that in the future the Soviet Union will collapse. And he says they're going to collapse because Stalin threw away the sword of Lenin, and now Khrushchev has thrown away the sword of Stalin, right? So Lenin is the capacity for revolution, and Stalin is the capacity for discipline. So these two elements, where you have to move through time by constantly waging in different generations revolution in order to continue to take or to continue to accelerate development and to not slip into the status quo or get stuck in some paradigm. So that's the first concern. And then what we see is in the wake of that, in the wake of this fear that the Chinese were misled in the first five-year plan, that's what leads the CPC to then believe that it's alone in the world and to initiate the Great Leap Forward, which is trying to imitate a program that the Soviets had undertaken when they believed that they were under attack and alone in the world. And so the Great Leap is really China's attempt to correct what they saw as some of the mistakes while continuing some of the investments from the first five-year plan. And the great tragedy of the Great Leap, we all know that people suffered, that there were a lot of lives lost. Disproportionately, they came from Anhui. Something in particular went sideways in Anhui related to environment, maybe local provincial leadership. But the thing that we're unable to say in China, even to this day, because we can never argue that the means justify the ends, is that with minor reforms in 60 and 61, the system of collectivized agriculture, which basically industrializes agriculture and allows China to become to establish food security and to generate the surpluses that will allow it to develop and finance its own industrialization, that will produce those outcomes and will feed China until the mid-1980s, when China then has the opportunity to advance new reforms that will move
with the reform and opening up era, right?
Right. So the main problem is that the Great Leap
So
um,
there's a
was
profound
a,
there's a silver lining to the Great Leap Forward that is often overlooked,
it's
is
not
what
just
you're
a silver lining, it's exactly what they intended. Okay.
right.
It's just it also came with a lot. But when you reform 90% of your economy in 3 to 4 years, there's going to be damage. There's going to be things that slide sideways, and indeed there was. Um, and the party will never say those costs were worth it. But I think oftentimes if you live in the Jacobin tradition, sometimes you have to argue that the ends do justify the means. And that's a difficult
Right.
thing that we always have to come back to, and to avoid the sort of idealism that leaves us vulnerable to fascists who certainly believe that. But so the Sino-Soviet split is really starting to move forward in '56, and then it's absolutely in place in '59, because in 1959, that's the year that the CIA sparked the Tibetan uprising. The Dalai Lama has later said the worst mistake he ever made was getting in bed with the CIA. All that's been declassified. You can go to the archives and see that. And then, of course, he flees overland to India. And then the first country other than India to welcome the Dalai Lama is the Soviet Union. So the US sparks it, India supports it, and then the Soviets recognize it. And that was a betrayal of the worst sort. And the reason it's a betrayal is, and the reason why Tibet, or what in China we call Xinjiang, is so important, is because that area, the Tibetan Plateau, is where the headwaters of all of China's major rivers are. So whoever controls the Tibetan Plateau controls agriculture in China, controls food security. This is why in the old days, the UK and Russia played the 100-year game, trying to gain control over Tibet. Whoever controls Tibet controls China, right? Whoever controls, they also were aiming for Afghanistan. Whoever controls Afghanistan controls Central Asia, and therefore other parts of Asia. So Chinese governments, going back a long time in the past, realized the importance of Tibet to their own national security. I would argue that Tibet is far more intrinsic to the national security of China than the Golan Heights is for Israel, and yet Israel gets a pass on the Golan Heights. So there's that. But
Well, I think it would be useful, Professor Mahoney, while you're giving this wonderful kind of historical reconstruction that's very helpful to bring us to the present and to address the present with more clarity, if you could also address the Cultural Revolution and your kind of general assessment of it. What's your read of the Cultural Revolution, and do you see it as a kind of historical necessity of the wider revolutionary process? Do you see it as a tragic mistake? How do you see the Cultural Revolution?
well, thank you for that, because I enjoy talking about it. The first point is, coming out of the Great Leap, which was far more successful than we acknowledge, what the leadership discovered, and they were discovering this in Vietnam, is that the world had in fact changed, that the world was no longer in the industrial age, it was now in the information age. Now, certain countries like the Soviet Union, the UK, the United States, and whatever remained of the scattered German intelligentsia knew that the Second World War began as an industrial war, but it ended as an information war, right? We have to understand that the U.S. having radar, the U.S. having atomic weapons are information bombs. It's not how many bombs you can produce, but how do you get this information to split the atom? And then all you need are 1 or 2 bombs and you can end the conflict. But it was in World War II where, of course, you have this massive investment in military technologies, and the general rule of thumb is that it takes about 20 years to innovate, to develop, to produce, and then to integrate those new weapons into your armed forces, your strategies, and so forth and so on. And so, in mid 40s, and then shortly thereafter, of course, it continues to accelerate with the Cold War. And then where are we in the mid 60s? This is Vietnam, and who, early 60s, mid 60s, who's backstopping the puppet regime in South Vietnam? It's the United States. And so these mass tactics, these old industrial tactics that China had used to stop the Americans in Korea, that they had used to knock the French out of Vietnam, they're no longer working in Vietnam. So they can see this firsthand, that this industrial model. And at the same time, you have things like Moore's law being expressed, the idea that technology advances at an exponential rate. And so the Chinese are witnessing firsthand that they're behind the curve in technology, and there's no way they can catch up by pursuing an industrial policy. And this is going to lead to the Cultural Revolution. And
can I ask one question very quickly? Can you give a context to the class dynamic? Because my understanding is that the initial thrust of the revolution obviously upsets the class system in a very profound way. To some extent, we have a pure abolition of the peasantry to some extent, or a radical recomposition of their condition. And we should never underestimate how wretched the condition of the Chinese peasant was before the Chinese Revolution. But on the other hand, there's a question, I think, at the heart of the Cultural Revolution of bureaucratic leadership and the empowerment of elements of the Chinese working class and peasantry into positions of leadership that did not have, that was producing some pretty profound antagonisms that had to be, that Mao felt that had to be disrupted in a certain way, which is why he advocates really at the beginning to do a mass study circle, a study investigation into the meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So something in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which, had gone awry, or something had gone rotten, perhaps, in it. Is that a fair analysis? And could you add to that, add the class element to your conversation on the Cultural Revolution?
So I think one of the problems is the way Western Marxists think about class struggle. That is going to lead them into some mistakes in understanding China. But let's be clear, when I'm talking about what's happened, sometimes I'm making reference to specific things that Mao said and specific justifications for policies. But as a Marxist, notwithstanding the fact that Mao Zedong is my favorite Marxist, even above Marx himself, and I never underestimate the strategic genius of Mao, or his unparalleled capacity for political organization, or his intuitive understanding of dialectics. And all of those things are linked, by the way, fundamentally. I also don't particularly care what Mao was thinking in a particular moment of time, because as a historical materialist, that doesn't really matter, right? As someone who looks at the world from a dialectical materialist point of view. So I'm not going to get distracted by a lot of rhetoric. What I'm really going to look at is what happened, and whether or not we consign this to this was intentional policymaking by the leadership, which certainly in some cases it is, or whether or not we revert to the old Hegelian understanding of the cunning of reason. What we can see is how things have moved forward. And so we can explain that movement with a lot more certainty than we can explain or rely on what Mao was thinking versus what other leaders were thinking, which may have been honest, may have been mistaken, or may have been attempts to mislead. I don't know. But the fundamental issue is that as I was telling you, and I've said this in other places, and you talked about Marxists being under attack in the West, and as you know, I was bought out and blacklisted in 2009 for my own political activities as a professor in the U.S., and then have worked in China since in exile. So I'm sympathetic to that, but the problem is, when I first came to Beijing, I came to China first in '98, but when I moved here permanently, it was 2010, and I was working for the top think tank of the Central Committee, and I would have lunch on a regular basis with one of the senior scholars, one of the senior party scholars, and I was a very failed, passionate, revolutionary Marxist, now relocated, and I was someone who was very much interested in Mao Zedong, and I remember talking with this scholar one day, and one day he suddenly laughed. And by the way, this was a man who was always very, very kind to me, and later was very kind to me. So it wasn't a mean laugh, but I felt a little diminished by the laugh. And he suddenly exclaimed, he says, in China, politics comes first, theory comes second. What we're really concerned about is how do we solve problems and how do we move forward? And then later, we will express that in theoretical terms to explain it to ourselves, but also to explain it to subordinates so that we can consolidate that line of thinking and actualize it around the country. So I think part of what you and I talked about before is that there's that the Chinese understanding of theory is different from method. And then a subset of theory would be, or excuse me, not a subset, but above theory would be thought. So let's say you have Mao Zedong thought, and within Mao Zedong thought, you have the method, which is going to be how Mao understands dialectical and historical materialism. And we see here that being expressed in on contradiction and on practice. It's just, despite the fact that so many people in the West reading those documents through the years, they always fail to see the importance of and versus or relative to the Soviet or the Western Marxist project. But then from there we get into okay, how do we create policies based on that understanding of method, that way of understanding the world. And so this is why we have a peasant worker alliance. This is why we have a second united front. This is why we are going to constantly be combining these contradictions, because it's through the combination of contradictions that we see the operation of the dialectic. It's not through the annihilation of contradictions, of one contradiction by another. So, and again, we can see this logic in Mao's understanding of Sun Tzu and the art of war, which plays a decisive role in the strategic thinking that allows them to win the revolution, but also resist the Japanese. And later how they will deal with the United States, which is you identify who your biggest enemy is, and you get as close to them as possible, and you learn as much as you can from them. You get as much as you can from them, and to a large extent make them dependent on you, so that if they try to hit you, then they risk hitting themselves. So this way of thinking about the role of contradiction and the conflict is very much different, I think, from the Soviet model and what many people think in the West when it comes to this. Now, with regard to the Cultural Revolution specifically, they're starting to realize that despite the tremendous gains associated with the Great Leap, which again is taboo to say, it's not enough. And they're going to have the only way that they can close the technology gap, the technology gap that had made them vulnerable to Western aggression in the first place in the early 1800s. The only way that they can close that gap, which is now widening at an exponential rate, is they have to draw close to one of the great powers, either the Soviet Union or the United States. Now, remember, in '56, Mao has already said that the Soviet Union is going to collapse. And he said it's going to collapse because they've thrown away their capacity to create revolution. and to self-discipline, and therefore they will stagnate. Okay, now, so he doesn't, and he also doesn't believe, he doesn't trust the Soviet Union. He thinks that they're a threat because he believes that they have colluded with the United States in some respects to try to limit power of the CPC in China itself, not only in terms of what happened in Tibet, but also, if for your viewers who know Mao Zedong's famous poem, "The Red Army Enters Nanjing." This was a poem that Mao wrote as a response to Stalin, because Stalin wanted a two-state solution. Initially, the United States wanted a two-state solution when the Kuomintang had the upper hand, and then later, when Mao had the upper hand, the Soviets wanted a two-state solution because they wanted a divided China that they could, control and manipulate. And Mao answered him with the Red Army enters Nanjing. So this was something that this was another issue. But in the early '60s, you're starting to realize that you have to draw close to one of the great powers in order to facilitate tech and capital transfers. Otherwise, you're going to continue to fall further behind, and you're ultimately going to lose. So then the problem is, which country do you draw close to, and how do you do that? Okay, so this is the thing that so many people miss when they think about the Cultural Revolution. Nominally, the Cultural Revolution is dated from '66 to '76 when Mao dies, right? And we remember the Cultural Revolution as a period of leftist excess, as a period of class struggle, right? And yet, it's also in the middle of that period that China opens to the United States. Do you think that those two things in a dialectical form aren't first and foremost in the strategic thinking of Mao Zedong? Furthermore, who are the two major figures that fall in the party during the CR? Liu Shaoqi and Lin Biao. What do they have in common? One of them we generally associate with being towards the right, and the other towards the left. But what do these two men have in common? They both favored opening or reopening to the Soviet Union. Now, the correct history of the CR should be understood as follows. In '66, before '66, you start the Mao Zedong reading groups, the Little Red Book, in the army to consolidate Mao's ideological position in the Red Army. Second, you then launch this society-wide, and you do this by mobilizing the urban left to knock down the urban right, right? What is Mao's power base in '66? It's the countryside, the urban left, and the army, okay? So you mobilize the urban left, you knock down the urban right, and then you send them all to the countryside, okay? And when do you do that? You do it in '68. And in '68, you declare, as he does, the Cultural Revolution over, right? And it's in '68 that he commissions the general study, and the generals who are now going to decide which country China should draw close to, the United States or China or the Soviet Union. The generals answer the United States, and that's when he starts initiating contact with the U.S. And trying to, and sending Edgar Snow. Initially, the U.S. doesn't take him seriously, but when they realize that they're serious, Kissinger and Nixon come. Okay, now, so basically, he clears the deck in the cities so that he can put in place this radical policy. At the same time, it's only in the last few years that that it's become safe to sort of do this research and publish. One of the things that was always sort of said about the Cultural Revolution is that the young people needed to go to the countryside to learn from the peasants, from the farmers. And this was indeed an objective, in so much as the Long March is something that taught the party the true nature of China, because so many people in the Communist Party were urbanites or people who had been influenced by France or the Soviet Union. But it's also the case that a large number of the youths that were sent down were put to work as teachers in the rural areas. And this is where we see the radical increase in literacy in Chinese people. It wasn't simply that the young people had to go to learn from the peasants. It's also the peasants were learning from the young people, and especially women. This is where we see the radical increase in female literacy rates during the Cultural Revolution. So that's what's really happening during the CR. And there's an interesting document you can find on Marxist.org where Mao Zedong is, it's titled something like "Meeting Between Red Guard Leaders in Beijing," and it's a fascinating read because Mao is calling out the army. He's calling out the army to suppress the Red Guards, and the Red Guard leaders are there, and some of them haven't showed up because they're being attacked by the other Red Guard leaders, and they're afraid they're going to get killed. And so they're sitting there. Mao Zedong is there. Zhou Enlai is there. Jiang Qing is there, and some of the leaders of the Red Guards are women, and they're looking to Jiang Qing, and Mao is saying, "Don't look at her, look at me." And he's saying, "You're wondering who's the black hand who called out the army against you? It's me. I did it." Okay. So Mao was always playing, even within the party, the left, the right, the center, in a dialectical fashion, but always preserving them as well, right? The other thing that a lot of people neglect in their understanding of Deng Xiaoping, because there are even some Chinese leftists who believe that Jiang Qing was supposed to be the leader. After, in fact, Mao said that Jiang Qing would fail because she didn't understand dialectics. But conversely, whenever foreigners would visit China, Mao would introduce them to Deng Xiaoping. And he would always introduce Deng in two ways. He would say, he's short, but he's a man of great stature. And second, he is the one who will be here after the rest of us are gone. Mm. And why did Mao know this? Because A, he knew that Deng was a man of talent, but also because Deng's power base was in the army. Right. It was Deng who, second to Mao, controlled the gun.
Wow. So that's a very helpful. Please.
Yeah, but I need to get one more point to speak directly to your question about class struggle.
Yes.
So, firstly, as a ruling party, you have a responsibility to represent everyone. And you have a responsibility, ultimately, to develop the country, but you can't develop everyone at the same level simultaneously. You can't develop every region simultaneously. There will be some regions that outpace others. So this idea that you can have a radical egalitarianism and make progress is really impossible, especially if you're going to be forced into tactics like drawing close to the United States in order to facilitate tech and capital transfers. So what you see is class struggle as a tactic, rhetorically and practically as a tactic for establishing and consolidating party rule. But this comes to an end in '68, and it is transformed. It's transformed because thereafter we have Mao introducing the three world theory, and Mao says, in it's Maoist dialectics to the core. There are three worlds. The first world, he says, is the Soviet Union and the United States. The second world are the countries that are in the toe of those two countries, and under the dominion of those two countries. And the third world are the countries that are in the struggle for an alternative. Okay. Now, in other words, the class struggle has been, we've now consolidated party control, party power, and that's now achieved in '68. And this leaves us in a position now where we can take the next step, which is we can now elevate the class struggle to the international level. Of course, '68, '69, China's going to find itself at war with the Soviet Union, and at the same time embracing the United States. And these two things are linked, right? So the class struggle is the third world, which China sees itself representing, against the first world, which is both the Soviet Union and the United States. But the tactics of the class struggle differ. So in the case of the class struggle with the Soviet Union, it's direct conflict. In the case of the United States, who you perceive to be a more dangerous enemy, a longer term enemy, what are you going to do? You're going to use the old Sun Tzu, because in Sun Tzu or in Mao's guerrilla warfare tactics, you go toe to toe with a foe that you can go toe to toe with, but with a foe that you can't go toe to toe with, you get as close to them as possible. So that's exactly what they do with the United States. So that's elevating the class struggle. So we've used class struggle to consolidate our position domestically. Now we're going to wage class struggle on an international level. And by the way, who introduced the three world theory to the world? It was Deng Xiaoping, who gave a speech at the United Nations in 1974 on Mao's behalf, which is not in Deng's selected works because it's taboo to acknowledge that Deng did anything from 66 to 76. But nevertheless, that's another document you can find on Marxist.org under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah, so with three world theory, the whole conception of imperialism also changes. And it's interesting. There's much to be said about that, but I want to keep our conversation more in this kind of historical genealogy that we've been developing leading up to more of the present. And I mean, I just wanted to read an often cited statistic and that will help frame this question about the contemporary class struggle, which is that 600 million people had their living standards drastically improved through the liberation of the forces of production throughout this whole period that you've been talking about, Great Leap Forward and beyond. And the latter had lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty during this period, which constitutes 7 out of 10 people worldwide that escaped poverty during this time. So that is sort of like a miracle in development, in human and social development. And it strikes me that contemporary Chinese Marxism is still very much in a kind of continuity with that history. It has not broken from that. I have the sense that Western Marxism is constantly breaking from its own. We have post-Marxism, we have a lot of disarray and sectarianism. There is a great deal of homogeneity of Chinese Marxist thought. So perhaps you might speak a little bit more about Deng Xiaoping to keep this going until we get more to the present, and what the meaning of the reform and opening up period means. There's a whole new conception, I think, of collective wealth that is put forward. But what I want to know from my point of view is to return to that fundamental question regarding, well, how does the class struggle inside of China mutate during this time? Given that we have this incredible transformation in education, in culture, in the conditions of the general working class, there's a lot. And then once you identify that, I want to share a few things that I've been reading about the contemporary class situation. It's the various strata of the middle layer of the Chinese class system, to what extent we have labor agitation going on in China. So I'm interested in some of those things, how much we know empirically about labor struggles, how vibrant they are, what role the party plays in mediating them, right? So maybe you could introduce Deng Xiaoping. You already had introduced him, but maybe you can give us more meat on the bones there.
Well, okay, so we were talking earlier about the Chinese understanding of contradiction and dialectics. And I think once you have a deeper understanding of that and function versus an or function in the dialectic, you can start to see the logic of things like socialist market economy. You can see the logic of programs like one country, two systems. You can see the development of ideas like socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's a long history, and it's difficult to it's difficult to hit all the points in a way that I think will satisfy everyone. But let me give you an example of that logic through and through. Okay. So I think some of your viewers will be aware that there were tremendous abuses of workers, especially related to Foxconn and other factories that were producing iPads and iPhones and so forth and so on in China. And these were cases that were highlighted in major news platforms, people committing suicide from overwork. And
this was in the late 90s, the turn of the century, up to the early 2010s period.
Right. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the worst abuses in China, by far, on average, I'm not saying that every firm, but on average, the worst abuses of workers were conducted by firms that were owned by Taiwanese investors. And the government allowed these abuses to persist effectively, not officially, but effectively, because under the rubric of one country, two systems, which had been used to bring Macau and Hong Kong back in, and which had been established as a model for reunification with Taiwan, Taiwanese businessmen, investors were given special privileges because they were Chinese from the Chinese perspective. They were given special privileges for investing in China that other foreign investors didn't enjoy. And then they were also protected once they got here. And the goal was to overexpose Taiwanese capital investment in the mainland to the point where Taiwan would effectively no longer be independent, economically speaking. And by the way, that worked. Taiwan is no longer effectively economically independent. Okay. Now, did that come at the expense of the workers who worked in those factories? It did. All right. And was that something that is Marxist we should find reprehensible? We should. But in the Chinese way of thinking, and the other thing that I didn't mention from the on contradiction is the introduction of what China calls the primary contradiction or the principal contradiction. So what is it? What is the thing that is most important to us that requires us to maybe make compromises on other fronts in order to achieve that? So reunification with Taiwan is more important to the Chinese leadership than, let us say, I'm not speaking officially for them in this regard, but let's just say in terms of the way the policies actually worked out, than the aggression that Chinese workers faced in Taiwanese firms located in the mainland. Why is that the case? Because Taiwan is a key component of the first and second islands chain strategies that the United States has used to try to contain and limit China's growth and development. Above all, by limiting Chinese submarine access to the oceans and the ability to implement a blockade if conflict comes to fore. And everyone knows this. So Taiwan it's not just, okay, it's our sovereign territory and we want to be reunited with our brothers, but it's also the place that the United States has used and continues to use as a key component in its aggression against China strategically. So the Taiwan issue is an issue of national sovereignty and national security, and more so than whether or not workers are going to face abuses, with the understanding that those workers were not forced to work in those factories. They could have quit, they could have gone to work in other factories, but for whatever reason, they chose to work there. And so in this sense, we can say while the government shares responsibility for allowing those abuses to persist, we know why they did it, and the workers themselves, unfortunately, vulnerable to those conditions. Some of them met terrible ends, but they were also free to choose. They weren't forced to work there. So I'm not breaking with workers there. I'm simply saying um, when people think of some of the worst abuses associated with workers, it's often those examples that they think of. And what I'm trying to do is explain the context of class struggle. So it's the class struggle between China and the United States, which is then trumping the class struggle of the workers in those factories, right?
Yeah.
Per the logic of principal contradiction. Now, in the case of the Deng years, it's absolutely the case that we began to see the generation of tremendous wealth and inequality. We did see ultimately 700 to 800 million people raised out of poverty, the elimination of extreme poverty. These were things that matured and reached their endpoint in the new era of Xi Jinping. What I can tell you is that I've been doing case studies in the countryside since the late 90s, and the transformation of the countryside is unbelievable. I simply don't think most people understand how much that has changed. Furthermore, the protections of workers since I've been here since 2010 incredibly changed. Now that the situation with Taiwan is what it is, those workers now in those Taiwanese companies are receiving protections as well. The other thing that has fundamentally changed, that has accelerated, especially since 2013, is cleaning up the air pollution and returning air quality, water quality to excellent levels in most parts of the country, making local party officials responsible, like what they call lifetime accountability for any spills or compromises of the environment that occurred during their watch. And this has returned what in Marxism we would call the ecological commons to the benefit of the people. It's simply
Is that connected to Xi's combating of corruption, which he put as a major, which I know is also tied, because one of the things we often hear a lot that I want your response to is that the Central Party will not allow for the consolidation of a capitalist class and an oligarchic class to go run amok and begin to take over various sectors of society, right?
right.
And that's tied to the anti-corruption approach, which has been at the center of Xi's philosophy of governance from the very beginning. So could you speak to that as well?
Historical context, one of the things that, so Mao Zedong said there needed to be a revolution every 10 years. And what he really meant was a revolution in the party itself, okay? Because the party can become bureaucratic and become resistant to change, right? It becomes entrenched and invested in whatever it has going on, and then it can stagnate the way the Soviets did. And this would lead to the failure of the party, but also the failure of the national rejuvenation project. So Mao says there needs to be a revolution every 10 years. And in part, the CR was aimed at that, was knocking down those who were resistant to radical change and advancing what we would normally call a party rectification campaign.
So Mao's claim there is not that we need a revolution akin to 1917 every 10 years, but he meant it more within the the culture of the party in particular. That's interesting.
If you look at who were the primary victims of the CR, the primary victims or the primary targets were party members themselves. And what was Mao's big character poster? Bombard the headquarters, attack the center. So, this was very much a war against what he saw as the propensity of the party itself to move into a form of stagnation. Now, Deng Xiaoping, of course, will resist this type of model, but he will try to institutionalize the same thing by creating 10-year generational cycles. So, leaders will have 10 years at the top, and he creates a whole system that will produce leaders at various levels They will cultivate talent, and they will rise through time and take their position. The problem is it didn't work. It didn't work. And it didn't work for two reasons. The first is the Jiang Zemin era, the third generation. They were so heavily invested in the radical economic growth and development, above all property, that and you know, they had all of their connections on the boards of state-owned enterprises, that when it came time to yield power to Hu Jintao in the fourth generation, they were able to continue to cling to power. And this is what led to the factionalization of the party. And so we had the Shanghai faction that we placed at Jiang at the center. We had the Tuan Pai faction, which Jintao was at the center. Tuan Pai, which tends to be a little more leftist, a little more rural-based. Shanghai, which tends to be more urban, coastal-based. And ultimately, Hu Jintao was unable to rectify the party. He was unable to push Jiang's people. Jiang wasn't able to stop Hu, but Hu wasn't able to stop and to push Jiang out. So they got gridlocked and stagnated. And this is what created the conditions that led to President Xi being empowered by the party to wage a party rectification campaign, which was about 15 years overdue. And he's empowered to do this in part because, unbeknownst to us, he was a master politician. And in China, if you're a master politician, the first thing you do is hide the fact that you're a master politician until you actually take power. And the way that he was able to move against the various factions step by step. He had the Hu Jintao group move against the Chongqing faction of Bo Xilai. That was the first critical step. They also wanted to move against him anyway. But then you had, he went after the Xishan group and the oil faction group, and then he went after Jiang's group. And Jiang's group was closely connected to the burgeoning oligarchs, including those in Hong Kong, which will then lead them to sort of foster what becomes in reaction to Xi, foster what becomes the umbrella revolution, and then later blossoms into the terrible stuff that we saw in the years later that came. So part of this was, so the failure is that this model that Deng put in place led to, and the fact that Jiang's group was in power the moment when all of this new wealth was being generated, left them in a position where they were thoroughly invested in the economy and were unwilling to surrender, above all because they didn't want to be rectified. But if you look at things like China's property crisis, this is largely the product of that old problem where Jiang's group was so invested in property that they would prevent any reforms that would allow alternative forms of investment to take place, because it kept pushing more and more money into the property sector, which kept their position stronger and stronger, which of course everyone else had to follow suit, and then ultimately it starts alienating young people who can't afford. So that, and then of course we have to clean up that problem, which is now largely cleaned up. It's this year. We anticipated it would be largely finished by the end of the year. It's certainly not the crisis that it was last year. But the key is that right before Xi took power, it was understood that this radical anti-corruption campaign is necessary so that we can rectify the party, so that we can improve governance, so that we can take steps forward. Otherwise, we risk losing everything. And the fact is, he is able to achieve and consolidate that rectification within the first 5 years of power. The outstanding question is, okay, what comes next? And I don't think that they have a clear understanding of that. But what is important to note is, as it became clear that China was in fact going to the CPC was going to consolidate the gains from the anti-corruption drive, this is when the United States really begins to accelerate economic pressure. This is when we start seeing talk of the pivot, and this is going to mature with Trump's strikes in his first administration and the trade war.
How much does Xi have a cult of personality following amongst the Chinese masses in today's time? How popular is he?
You know, you hear this sometimes, and
A lot of people say it in the West. I think they probably exaggerate it, is my guess, but I'd be curious.
I would suggest that the president is very much aware that too much of a cult of personality is a bad thing. Why? Because if you are the only game in town, then you're ultimately responsible for anything that goes wrong. And, I think what we've seen I think there's certainly been efforts to bolster his image and constantly reinforce his image. But I think most people understand that he is largely the face and the chief politician at the center, but that the CPC is something, as an organization, is much bigger than the man. That being too much, that fostering a cult of personality would provoke reactions from people who don't like that, not just internationally, which China doesn't care about, but domestically. But ultimately, if you become responsible for everything, and then there are problems, then getting rid of you is the solution. So,
Right. Right.
so it's not something that lends itself to institutional stability, and I think the party and the president understand this. Now we do see. I think one of the misunderstandings of the party that happens a lot internationally, and certainly this is encouraged by Washington, is that the party and China, it's all a monolith under one man. And the fact of the matter is, it's a massive party, the largest political party in the world, largest government in the world, and they are representing everyone. And this includes people who are loyal to the party but hate each other because they have competing interests and values. People connected to the coal industry in Shanxi hate the green transformation, right? So these are things that the party has to balance and constantly. So if you go back to the idea of struggle or class struggle or different struggles, the party has, as the ruling party, has a responsibility to mediate. There is a dialectic, there is a struggle between different groups, but the party's role is to mediate this in the and function, so that we actually grow together and progress together, as opposed to collapsing in conflict with each other. So this is where I think, Westerners who think about class struggle as something we have to have because we need to go out and actualize the revolution, they've already had the revolution.
Right.
Now it's
Right.
about actually, yeah.
No, that's quite helpful, and I suppose some of the mottos of Xi have such a ambitious, historical, and future-oriented agenda, where he's talking about moving from age of prosperity to age of strength in the future, right? And so there is a certain a kind of benefit that the socialist project has compared to where we are at in the West. It's almost too difficult to draw a type of comparison because it is so singular and unique. But I suppose if you could articulate for my viewers a little bit more, if you don't mind, about the current status of the social classes in China. Like, for example, you had said in the earlier conversation we had that you don't use the word middle class, but a lot of commentators have said that we were seeing something like this in contemporary China. what's your sort of analysis of the social classes, and to what extent are antagonisms and contradictions born from this? I mean, if we are, and I mean, Xi is a historical materialist, and I think the guiding thread of historical materialism, and I think Mao would affirm this as well, is the persistence of class struggle. So we're at an interesting stage where even Deng said that didn't he say something, to paraphrase, that the class struggle is reaching a level of harmony? Use this concept. So is that true? Um, how would you assess that for us? I guess we're returning full circle to one of my first questions, but you've given us the history to maybe get at it more clearly now.
So I'd make a couple of quick points. Before I came on to record this morning, I did a live show with RTHK, a radio station in Hong Kong, to discuss what the U.S. is doing presently against Venezuela. And, I think as Marxists, as socialists, we should be horrified by what's happening there and why it's happening. But one of the things that you should understand is that Venezuela is a key partner in the Belt Road Initiative, and by some estimates, China has invested more than 60 billion in Venezuela, and this, of course, it has drawn the United States ire. If you read the U.S. national security document, it basically says we're not going to allow any foreign power to help out countries help them develop in Latin America, and inserts the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine to this end. And when Obama turned against Gaddafi, go back and check the records how many Chinese had to leave Libya in the wake of that. So this is nothing new, but I would say that in the context of all the various international projects that we see China advancing right now, I use a term that I use this even in Beijing, and it kind of irritates people. They like it, but it's taboo. I call it new internationalism, and it's very different from the old Soviet internationalism, but it's definitely a new internationalism. There's definitely a much broader project through the Belt Road Initiative, but also through the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global Governance Initiative, as well as the new international organizations that China is helping foster, like SCO+, BRICS, and others. And I agree with the person that I was on the program with this morning that Venezuela is a target because it has the world's largest proven oil reserves. And we know the role of oil in terms of propping up the dollar. But Venezuela is also home to rare earths and minerals, including coltan, which is why Obama accelerated sanctions in 2015. So, but I agree with the gentleman this morning who was saying that Venezuela is a stepping stone to Brazil, and this is something that I think all of Latin America should be concerned about right now, and no doubt are. Now, so I want to bring that international element to it, because remember, class struggle is not just a domestic thing, it's an international thing. And the extent to which China is contributing positively to the international class struggle,
Right,
by producing, helping to close the digital divide, the fact that Ethiopia now is more technologically advanced than Germany, helping to push out green transformation and development to countries. It's the global South that is most vulnerable to climate change. It's the global South that's most vulnerable to energy problems and food security. So China is playing a constructive role in what I would say is a new internationalism to try to liberate countries that had been suppressed essentially by these old models. The Washington Consensus and everything that came before it, and perpetual wars that we've seen waged by the United States and its close allies Um, so that's that. And then, we talked about the problem of the workers in the Taiwanese companies and how that is now being resolved in a positive way. But let's talk about another issue that we can see in Shanghai, and that I attend Marxist conferences in China. We talk about this problem in the Marxist conferences in China, the problem of the delivery drivers and the what we call the Didi.
The gig economy, right?
Yeah, the gig economy, and
Casualized proletariat, right?
right.
Yeah, unstable wage workers.
Right. So there is an argument that that China is already that the conflict between China and the United States has sharpened considerably. That the class struggle between China and the United States has sharpened considerably. And one of the things that has one of the things that this is focused on is technology. Your viewers or listeners wouldn't know that in my first graduate degree was in epidemiology, that I was a public health officer with the Centers for Disease Control in the mid-90s, and that I understand fundamentally where COVID came from. I know that the science bears out that it is the product of climate change, that it was the fourth coronavirus outbreak, and that it was predicted. It was predicted in 2015. It was named Disease X in the literature, and it was predicted because at that point we had already had 3 coronavirus outbreaks: SARS-1, SARS-2, and MERS. And coronaviruses are especially vulnerable to small changes in the environment. And so it was well understood that this was a lurking threat. And this is why you had all of these laboratories around the world doing research on coronaviruses. It's why the vaccines, the Moderna vaccine, was so advanced, because they were already working on it. It's why in October 2019, even before they know about COVID, the CDC delivered a coronavirus outbreak response plan to the White House in the United States. So, and yet there was only one country that adequately handled that public health crisis, despite it being the country where it was first noticed. We don't know that it necessarily started here, but it was the country that took the first hit. It was the country that warned the world. It was the country that got it under control, reestablished production, provided all of the things that the world needed to survive, while the rest of the world fell into chaos, while the United States increased the money supply by 20% in order to paper over, right, and then exported that various instability around the world, and which will contribute ultimately to the conflict in Ukraine, among others. Now, the key point here is that China sacrificed economic growth and development for the greater public good. Estimates are that if China had not had controls, they would have lost 10 to 15 million people. The United States lost about 1,500,000. Some estimates go as high as 2 million. Let me put that to you in public health terms. There's other data that indicates that the average number of years lost by people who died, 10 years. Okay, 10 years. So that it's not all people who were old and who were getting ready to die. The average is 10 years. So, and the 3 friends that I had who died from it, one of them was younger than me, and the other was the same age, and one of them was elderly in the US. So if you have 1 million, and you have 1 million people, and you have 10 years, that's 10 million life years that were lost. This is how we think in public health policymaking. So the failure of the United States, 15 million life years, minimum, lost because of the failure to deal effectively with COVID. Now, China was able to hold the line until it wasn't, because the rest of the world dropped. And when China finally dropped the policy, it financially could no longer hold the line. Politically, it could no longer hold the line. And there were 112 variants already active at that point. So the only way they could have continued to hold the line is to lock the whole country down and kill themselves. So ultimately, they dropped the controls, and then we saw a significant number of people die in China. But they didn't die for 3 years, which means they preserved. So this is the way the Chinese government thinks. How do we preserve life? How do we, we have a choice where we can do it the way Russia did or what other countries did and just absorb the losses, or we can be responsible for the well-being of people, including the most vulnerable people in the country, the people most vulnerable to COVID, the elderly people, and the people who have other health conditions. And that's what they did. That to me
let me ask a question about that, if I might. Because that's not immediately evident as to why that's the case. Do you think, in a thought experiment, an alternate history in which the Chinese bourgeoisie of the nationalists, let's say, were to have been victorious over Mao and the Red Army, and there was a continuity, there was no communist revolution in China, I don't think the capitalist bourgeoisie would have such compassion. Do you?
Well, it's difficult to say, because it's so hypothetical. I'll tell you two ways to think about it. The first is, what was the other part of the world that did a really, really good job controlling because of the pandemic? It was Taiwan.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay.
And Taiwan actually has a pretty robust national health system. And social welfare system. Of course, Taiwan is a free rider on the very, very favorable policies they receive from China and the very, very favorable policies they receive from the United States. So they're able, in that condensed small island context, to provide those types of services. In China's case, you have to understand that there is no bourgeois revolution that could succeed. And purely speaking, there's no Leninist revolution that could succeed in the narrow Leninist sense either. It had to be a revolution that brought the peasants into the political equation and turned them into citizens, right? Without that, and without a political system that can do that in a way that will then shepherd all of those illiterate people, all of those people who are not well prepared, but in that party vanguard way, but at the same time without moving in the direction of the sort of excesses that we see in places like Cambodia, as well as other countries where things went too far in the wrong direction. I don't think there's a modern China without that. The only way you can create and sustain a modern nation is by turning all those people into citizens who then have a vested interest in the well-being of the nation. And a bourgeois state, or the Kuomintang solution, would never work, and couldn't work precisely because it couldn't do that, because it was too much embedded in a comprador situation, but also the old ruling elites, the warlords, who were dependent on sustaining that old mode of production, where the vast majority of people would remain in a subaltern peasant position.
Is contemporary China an imperialist state? Or, because I've interviewed experts who contend that in fact we should not conceive of China as imperialist at all. So why is that the case? Because certainly one could say that perhaps they have the power to be such. What are the mechanisms that regulate or check that? Other than is it reducible to the guiding philosophy of the party itself and its own foundation in its past, in Marxism and so on? How do we understand that?
It's a complicated discussion, and it's one that has, I think, traditional historical values that are not always articulated in contemporary Marxism policymaking, but I think are culturally influential. You can go back in the pre-modern times and see. So I have a theory that I will advance and try to advance it hand in hand with some historical references to try to illustrate the issue. The Qin dynasty, not the Qing, the last one, but the first after. So you had the Shang, which the Chinese would say the Xia were first. It's really a Neolithic kingdom. Whether or not it's a dynasty is a matter of historical debate. Then you have the Shang dynasty. Then you have the Zhou dynasty. Then you have the spring and autumn period where you start to see the country falling into different states at war with each other. Then you have actually the warring states period. And then you have the emergence of the Qin, who will reunify and create a new dynasty. And what the Qin, of course, we in the West, we almost always associate with the terracotta warriors of Qian, right? If people want a visual image. And what the Qin did is they created, what's the right word here? A proto-modern state. They were the first to invent bureaucracy as we would know today, meritocracy as we would know today, state exam system as we would know today, standard units and standard weights and measures.
This is circa when? Historically, this is pre-Napoleon, way pre-Napoleonic, right?
Oh, this was way before Jesus.
Right. Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
so a long time ago, before Romans, maybe. In any event, I'm sorry that I don't have the date off the top of my head, but one of the things that happens is I can check quickly here. But one of the things that happens is you will even have people like Fukuyama, I think his book, The Origins of Political Order, who is an unreliable scholar in every respect. But he, makes this sort of backhanded compliment that the first modern state is the Qin. And then says something like, and the Chinese haven't advanced very much since. But nevertheless, what's interesting is that we could argue that the state development in China is about 1,000 years ahead of everyone else in terms of the innovations in governance that they're making. And what they then begin to, we could argue for days about why they innovate this. What's unique about Chinese civilization and culture? Is it because it's a river valley? There are all sorts of theories. But the fact of the matter is they did innovate it. And the Qin dynasty itself didn't last very long. It was replaced by the Han dynasty and later the Tang dynasty. And they both realized the incredible achievement. They demonized the Qin, but they kept that system and built it and built it and built it. And by the way, it survives all the way until 1905, 1910. Okay, the imperial exam survives until 1905. And that's thousands of years. You have different political changes in terms of the dynastic cycle, but the system, the education system, the bureaucracy, all of it is largely the same throughout that period of time. Now, one of the arguments that I would make is that this system discovered that it had a natural limit. That if it were to go beyond that limit, it would imperil the system itself. And the system itself the Chinese had fallen in love with the system, at least the people who ran and operated the system. Now, what's different between that and the innovations that we see in the West is that in the West, we tend to innovate some new technological ability. For example, Alexander's father innovates a new weapon and a new military formation, and they take that all the way to India. But they don't innovate a comparable political technique that would allow them to consolidate and hold that. Right. We see the same problem in the Roman Empire. They never discovered a political system that would allow them to have a comparable type of continuity and stability that the Chinese enjoyed. And they were constantly at war. They were constantly changing their government system, radically shifting from democracy to republic to dictatorship to absolute monarchy, and never able to achieve and sustain. But we find the opposite in the Chinese context. There are moments when China does cross its borders. There's a moment more than 1,000 years ago when they extend down into what is today Vietnam. But they soon discover that that's not a sustainable position, and they pull back. Now, the Vietnamese nationalists today still point to that as the risk of an imperial China. But my point is, so there wasn't necessarily a principle that says we don't aggress against others, but there was a principle that you don't imperil the system. And if you overextend the system, you imperil the system.
Yeah.
And we can see this with the Admiral Zheng, who took the ships. He was a Muslim Chinese. Maybe people are aware of the Great Fleet that he took all the way to Arabia. And China at that point was the biggest naval power, the strongest country in the world. And when he came home, the Chinese government dismantled the fleet and said no more of that, because I think they realized how destabilizing it could be to the system that they valued above all.
I see.
And at the same time, they began to develop a type of two ways of thinking. One was this idea that China was the center. So Zhongguo means literally center, or the middle kingdom, the middle of the world. Okay. Now this is going to sound ethnocentric, and indeed it was, but that China was at that time the most advanced culture, civilization, scientific nation in the world. And that the further and further out you went, the further you got from the center, the more you encountered people who were barbaric, people who could not be governed. And so it was best to try to avoid them, right? And at the limits of your empire or your state, you would use a tribute state system to create buffers. So you wouldn't conquer these small countries. I mean, China today has more countries on its border than any other country in the world. You would create this tribute state system where, okay, we recognize you, you recognize us, and we're going to make sure that we don't fight with each other. It was really a way of trying to create shared security, but with the idea that if I go out and mess with you, I'm just going to expose myself. First, I might be able to defeat you, but I don't want to go to war with everyone. And would I be able to rule you afterwards? No. So you do you, I'll do me. And by the way, the tribute state system really worked in those small countries' favors. They would make these tribute trips to China whenever they could, because they always got more from the Chinese than they gave themselves. And China had to start limiting them because they were giving so much money and wealth and resources to these smaller countries. So that's sort of the old model. And some people wonder to what extent that legacy, which created that laid some of the foundations for the ethnicities and countries that exist today, to what extent is the Chinese international relations system, at least in China or in the environs of this region, reflective of a tribute state system? I think that there are important historical links and explanations, but I don't think that we have a tribute state system today.
You could even think of something like Belt and Road along that framework. Is that sort of one way to think about that? Because it's definitely not a type of imperialist project, right? I mean, maybe people could make an argument that there's an economic imperialism dimension to it, but I don't quite see it myself. It was just very interesting. Yeah.
Belt and Road has been maligned in a lot of different ways, and I'm not going to go through a long defense of that. Where we've seen Belt and Road, and increasingly we're seeing it play a role in Latin America, Peru, Venezuela, that is
Africa.
I'm saying in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, that's terrified the U.S. The U.S. can't stop it in Africa now. But where it's strongest is in Southeast Asia and Central Asia. And these are the areas that are most directly connected to Chinese security. We know that Belt and Road was used in part. So Belt and Road is a bilateral arrangement, and if you look at the way Belt and Road complements something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so China had to respond to U.S. penetration of Central Asia after 9/11, which allowed the U.S. to encircle China with conventional weapons during that time. But in order to create the economic incentives to push to get those countries to push the American forces out, they had to create some sort of investment and development scheme, because that's what the U.S. was promising in one form or another. But in order to do that in a way that didn't alarm or alienate Russia, which Russia considers Central Asia to be its sphere of influence, and not simply because of the historical, but because a large part of Russia's air defense system is still built in Central Asia, they had to work hand in hand with Russia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to ensure that they weren't operating as a hegemon or an imperial power. And then ultimately, to further advance those efforts, they had to bring India in as a major partner. And so I think in this paradigm, we begin to see the actualization of avoiding imperialism and hegemony as a way of constructing greater security in Asia. And President Xi's made it clear that security for China begins in Asia. And if we can create security in Asia, then we'll be able to help promote. And so then thereafter, you see more engagement with Iran and the countries in the Middle East. And we've seen this massive reconciliation this year between China and India. So I think what China has done is convinced Russia and India that it is not seeking hegemony because, firstly, it understands that it can't exercise hegemony over Russia or India, right? And you would have to do that if you were going to. It's not like the United States, which is in the largest power in the West, and has both Europe and Japan locked in security traps because of the legacies of World War II, and the Cold War. But so the only way that China can move forward is without moving in the direction of imperialism. And the only way China can move forward in its economic development, as it realizes it's going to run into increasing friction with the West as it's risen, is to have productive, positive relationships with the global South. And the only way that's going to work is if these countries are developing and able to trade increasingly equitably with China in ways that will allow the Chinese economy to continue to develop along with these. So, China doesn't have a Europe or anymore, or even Japan that it can depend on for markets. So it has to cultivate these more advanced markets in other places.
I have a final question for you. Do you put any credence or stock in the concept of what is often invoked as multipolarity? Based on everything you're saying now, I'm assuming that you probably don't like that concept too much, or rather, maybe you don't think that it really is applicable to China, precisely because, for what you just said, a lot of people that are socialists, right, that I speak to on my show, some of them are kind of split. Some of them like the idea of multipolarity. I think it's quite dangerous because it's almost a kind of quasi celebration of militarism in a certain way. I think it's dangerous in that regard. I don't think socialists should be doing that, especially after everything we know about what happened in the SPD in Germany with war credits and Kautsky and everything leading up to World War I. What are your thoughts as an international relations specialist and scholar about multipolarity? Do you think it's a useful concept?
I can tell you what the official position is in China, which is we are living now in a multipolar world, that this is the reality of the situation. So whether you like that or not is not the first point, it's the reality. And secondly, that this reality is preferable to living in a unipolar world, where the unipolar world is dominated by the United States. So the extent to which we see China embracing a multipolar world is the extent to which we see China asserting that it has risen as a major power, and it now commands a position and is able to resist the hegemony and unipolar actions of the United States. And I think as a socialist or a leftist, or as an anti-imperialist, whatever your stripe may be, you ought to welcome that. Now, does this mean and by the way, we also see people in the Trump administration basically acknowledging that we're in a multipolar world today, and Russia and Brazil and others.
And BRICS,
now,
BRICS is a part of that, right?
Yeah. It's also clear, though, that not everyone has the same value of a multipolar world. So, for example, Alexander Dugin's idea of a multipolar world probably isn't going to sit well with a lot of socialists, and nor is the White House view of a multipolar world.
Right. That's my hesitation too. That's
I don't think we should take it. I don't think we should say, okay, there's a single view on what that means or how people aim to reposition in this new reality that already exists. It's clear that China is trying to move forward with what they call a shared future for humanity, that China is trying to move forward, especially with solidarity with the global South, that China is trying to move forward with what is a very active strategic response to what is the greatest threat to China, which is climate change. And so I don't think that there's sort of this that the Chinese right now are visualizing multipolarity as the be all end all of human development, but they do envision through that. So we're always in different stages of conflict and development. And the stage of conflict and development that we're in right now globally is known as the period of multipolarity, which is not to say that it is the endpoint that we seek, right? But it is simply a descriptive of where we are now and where the struggle now takes place. So, so I don't think there's a normative embrace or a teleological embrace of multipolarity as the be all end all. It's just where the struggle is now, and how we move forward in this moment in time.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Mahoney, for your time and insights. It's been a tour de force. I've learned quite a lot in this conversation.
I'm sorry it was so fractured, but it's really it's difficult to distill so much information down.
No, it really was helpful. This was exactly what I wanted to get out of this conversation. I don't see it as fractured myself. I thought it was an excellent the history was essential. Starting from the core logical root of the contradiction all the way up to Xi and his thought into the present. I think on the multipolarity, I think you're right. I'm more familiar with it through these kind of reactionary frameworks that sort of valorize war and conflict as a method for, I don't know, socialism or socialist struggle. That's my challenge with it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you should be suspicious, and I'm certainly one who's always sort of promoting this idea of a new internationalism, but because ultimately I'm going to be an internationalist Marxist in terms. I'm a Chinese Marxist, but an internationalist at heart. But I think, there was a point that I wanted to go back to briefly. You asked, why isn't China imperialist? And I would add two quick points to this that would maybe bring a coda to our conversation. One is, I was saying earlier that in this traditional sense that there was a realization that there were that there were sort of cultural, ethnic, linguistic limits to the Chinese system, that there was a natural limit. So part of it was the extent to which you could expand that system and have it work functionally, but also it couldn't go beyond the cultural boundaries because it wouldn't make sense to people, because they have different ways of thinking, different ways of connecting, different understanding of the world. So that's true today, in so much as the Chinese political system is not portable. It's not portable. The way that the party is organized, there's no other party state system that is organized and goes down to the grassroots of society the way this one does. And so as a result, China has never fallen into this idealist trap of this democratic universalism that you could just take the Western model and impose this on Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, and that God would work his magic and everything would be fine. So China realizes that not only can its system not rule others, other people can't simply copy its system and rule themselves. That's one point. The second point is China is very proud of the fact, and you can see this in a lot of the documents being produced by the state, that they were able to find the solution to development without doing the things that the Western countries did: imperialism, slavery, genocide, war, dispossession. How much of Western primitive accumulation is financed by stealing people and resources from Africa, for example. So China says, we were able to find a solution to development that doesn't require that dark path, and indeed actually raises people out of poverty. It actually creates common prosperity. And so this is the message that I think that it has become a big part of its own identity. We don't have to do those things in order to become powerful. We didn't do those things and we became powerful. And the people who did do those things have found themselves on the losing end of history now. So why would we copy a model that doesn't work? And that's wrong. So that's the sort of the coda on the conversation on why China is an imperialist. It doesn't work, and it is bad. It's evil. So don't do it, because at the end of the day, China cares most about what works.
Right. And then I guess my final point would be, just so everyone, if it's okay, you are a member of the Chinese Communist Party and you're not originally from China. So a lot of my
I'm not.
listeners may
I'm
wonder that. And that
not a
is the
member.
policy of the party, is that it is inclusive. So could you say something briefly, maybe a bit about your role within the party?
I'm not a member of the party. To be a member of the party, you have to be a citizen of China.
Oh, I see. Okay, I thought that you were. Okay.
I am a permanent resident, which means I have a Chinese ID card, but I am not a citizen of China. But I think it's fair to call me what would be a little more than a fellow traveler. I do work closely with the party. I don't represent them officially. I continue to undertake projects with the Central Committee. Sometimes these are advisory roles. Sometimes I'm asked questions and they want my thoughts. These are confidential exchanges. But sometimes I'm working on other projects. For example, I've been in Hainan the last month trying to support the effort there to launch the world's largest free trade port, to further facilitate reform and opening up. And I've been joining some projects in Beijing, reinforcing grassroots democracy and policy making. As an observer and as an advisor. So these are things that I embrace because it's very informative and enlightening as a scholar who's interested in these things, but also because I'm completely comfortable embracing these political projects given my own political ethos. So,
Right.
um, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. That's extremely helpful, and I will put a link to some of your work, to your LinkedIn profile, which is extensive and very active, so folks can learn more about your writing. And hopefully, we can have you back on the show in the future and continue this collaboration. It's been very, very enlightening.
Well, Daniel, thank you for hosting me, and you know, I told you when we were talking before that I wanted you to be more aggressive. It turns out you were still a sweetheart, and I guess I appreciate that. I was coming
Well,
in ready to rumble,
I
but
mean, I don't want to be
I know that you
cliched
like to
about
take
my
things to.
aggression. I think that my aggression or my questions or my skepticism about China has to always be kind of put into context of my absolute despair about the Western and particularly the American political realities. So much of what you're talking about in China sounds like our future, in fact, or a future that we hopefully will find as some sort of rallying point for international socialism, for international communism.
Yeah, you know, I have nothing but empathy there, and you know, I was involved in efforts before, and those didn't work out. And ultimately, when I was being pushed out, I wasn't supported, and I accepted that. And then I tried various re-engagements with the left in the United States and Europe, and that didn't work out because there was too much, you know, fragmentation and a desire to, I think, have sort of radical idealist conversations about theory and to differentiate one from another. And it's been just a catastrophe, I think. Um, and I don't blame the left for that. I think we know the historical reasons for that. But I haven't been much engaged. I've been much more devoted to contributing to progress here and how that relates to the global South, and certainly in building the Ecological Civilization Center to try to focus those efforts on climate change and the problems that it raises for China and my children who are here, everyone. But I have been encouraged by you, by some of your friends, that I needed to try to re-engage and to describe what was happening in China a little bit more, because there was so much misinformation, and the extent to which
There's so much.
people have
Yeah.
found is something that I'm very much committed to contributing to. As far as how to address the political problems that you face, I don't know. I don't know. You know, I've become so disengaged from that. I don't know, but and I'm not being dismissive and simply saying good luck, but I am very concerned that we'll continue to see a right-wing reaction before we see a real progressive leftist solution emerging. But
Right.
hopefully you guys can do something better than that. But
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think part of that answer is generational in terms of the leadership of the institutions of the capitalist ruling order may change
you know, that's one of the
as
things. That's one of the things that I always say, that like on the first or second day of the Marxism seminar that I teach here to Chinese students. I say, you know, the one of the greatest things, one of the greatest contributions to human progress is that people die, and you know,
right.
old ideas, old people. And I don't say that with some sort of disrespect for old people, but you know, it's a fact of the matter that old ideas and old ways of thinking pass from the scene.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but clearly, the problems in the United States are much more than generational, um, and you know, I think it will take the collapse of the dollar um, to which is I think is probably closer than many realize, um, to really precipitate more fundamental change. But that's one of the reasons why they're moving against Venezuela, to try to reinforce the
Absolutely.
dollar. So
Absolutely. I think that imperialism is also an attempt to placate contradictions of the domestic class struggle that they wish to avoid or to sort of reroute, because there's a lot of domestic problems, from the jobs report to the inflation to unemployment.
Yeah, if you want my quick analysis, and this is a thumbnail, I know that you already know this, but the greatest opportunity you have is that people like Marco Rubio and the London financiers and others who are pushing this intervention in Venezuela, which, you know, a big part of Trump's base don't want. They don't want that.
No, they don't want it, right?
And trying to, you know, turn fentanyl into a weapon of mass destruction in order to, you know, encourage, you know, and fentanyl has nothing to do with Venezuela, to encourage his base to go along with him in Venezuela. I think ultimately, you know, the thing that could happen is that, you know, you go back to Reagan and the unholy alliance of the conservative coalition of social and financial conservatives, which fell apart, catastrophically fell apart with George W. Bush, where the true face of that was revealed,
right?
You know, and people had to face that as they saw, okay, he doesn't really care about Jesus, he doesn't really care about religion, and guess what? You get the global financial crisis, you get to lose all your equity, and you get to lose your health insurance, and you get hooked on opioids, all those things, right? And which is then going to create the opening for Obama, who, you know, as a liberal, isn't actually able to solve any problems, which is going to open the door to Trump. Okay, but Trump is a dead end. It's a dead end. So the best you can hope for is that you know, if we continue to see people realizing that Trump isn't actually solving their problems, then this may create a political alternative. Unfortunately, I think that the general trajectory, the general logic in the West is that when they reach these crises, they move to the right. We saw that being the dominant force in Europe, leading into World War II. And it's the more likely, I agree with this one point from Zizek, that it's the more likely course of action in the West. But there is an opportunity, I think, to try to push forward. But you're going to face all sorts of problems because the left is so fragmented now. The left doesn't know how to deal with religion or culture, aside from fragmenting it further. So I don't know how to move that forward, but I hope there is a way. Anyway, I have to go.
All the best. Thank you so much.
I know conversation, and I've enjoyed it. So thank you for having me.
All the best. Okay, we'll talk soon, comrades.